NSCAA's communications manager, as well as today's moderator. So early last week, as you may have heard, a joint statement was released stating that a resolution has been reached in the concussion litigation filed in August 2014 against U.S. Soccer and several other soccer associations. So from that, these organizations will embark on a comprehensive safety campaign, the details of which will be released in the coming weeks. So our panelists today will be discussing that, as well as some of the ways coaches can keep in mind on how to implement this when it does come through. Our panelists today are Ian Barker, Director of Coaching Education at the NSCAA, and Sam Snow, Coaching Director for US Youth Soccer. If you're new to our NSCAA Hangouts or just need a refresher, as you're watching and you have questions, please be sure to send them in. You can send them in one of two ways. One is to tweet them using hashtag NSCAA Live, or you can email them to marketing@nscaa.com. And we'll try to address as many as we can on air, but we'll just kind of roll on from there. So to set the stage for today's conversation, Ian, would you give us an overview of this resolution?
Sure. Well, certainly the thing that's hit us most in the sort of popular understanding is all about heading. Everybody's talking about heading. But actually, the lawsuit talks a lot more about concussion awareness, which obviously concussions could be a result of heading, but they're also the result of other injuries that kids sustain in the game, which could be head-to-head, head-to-goalpost, head-to-ground, so on and so forth. So whilst the actual technique of heading is something that I think Sam and I will probably end up talking a lot about today, and your guests or your audience, will have questions about, this is about a much more comprehensive addressing of the notion of concussion awareness.
Sam, do you have anything to add to that?
I think it's important to keep in mind, as Ian said, that it's more about the concussion piece in this litigation than it is about the particular technique of heading. So when I look at the press release from U.S. Soccer, one of the excerpts I pulled out of there, which I'll just read to everyone just as a reminder. Steve Berman, lead counsel for the plaintiffs, said, "We filed this litigation in an effort to focus the attention of U.S. Soccer and its youth member organizations on the issue of concussions in youth soccer. With the development of the Youth Concussion Initiative by U.S. Soccer and its youth members, we feel we have accomplished our primary goal." So this litigation wasn't about the skill of heading per se. It was about concussion management. And when I think you look at U.S. Youth Soccer, I know for sure, I would think AYSO, U.S. clubs, say, would have similar protocols in place. U.S. Youth Soccer, I know for sure, has protocols already in place that we've been utilizing for the last 3 or 4 years in our national championship series, in our national league, etc., in terms of dealing with concussion.
Perfect. And then starting with you, Sam, what do you think this player safety campaign will look like once it is released?
Well, that's a fuzzy crystal ball, but trying to guess at that a little bit, I would hope that perhaps some of it would include some directives to referees if we want to reduce the potential incidences of head-to-head contact and that such, where more concussions actually occur. Then some of that is properly enforcing the laws of the game. And so hopefully some of that is directives to referees to help with that part in the youth soccer arena. What are some of the other initiatives? Well, if we're looking at some of the other potential safety coaching in terms of coaching proper technique where injuries might occur, then I would throw one into that group along with proper teaching of how to head the ball. Would also throw in proper teaching of how to dive for goalkeepers and how to tackle for field players. When those 3 skills in particular are done incorrectly, there's a chance for injury to the person executing the skill or to other players.
Ian, do you have anything to add as far as what you think this might look like?
Well, certainly in the environment, in terms of concussion awareness, you'd like referees to be as well trained as the coaches. Hopefully the coaches are trained. you'd like people to use their best judgment and be prepared to stop games, maybe even postpone a game or delay the game. There's a substitution allowance, which would allow for a player to be removed from action and not count against you as a sub, and you can play with the full numbers and then reintroduce the player if it's appropriate. I think that's very, very helpful. But we certainly also want coaches to be mindful that if there's any question of a concussion-related injury, that the kid should be withdrawn from the activity and all the protocols gone through, and that the short-term gain of a victory or a result, it certainly comes far secondary to the well-being of the kid. And that's what the concussion awareness protocols talk about. The CDC concussion awareness program, which we were all required to go through as part of our U.S. Youth Soccer Olympic Development Program training, was a great little program. Took, I think, about 45 minutes to take, and did heighten my awareness of what to look for and what to do, with the bottom line being err on the side of caution all the time, for sure.
Perfect. And has there been concussion reform in the sport overall? I mean, as science has kind of progressed, there's been a lot of discussion, but has there been reform in this type of manner before? Ian, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, certainly, as the concussion across all sports has become more of an issue, we have had more requirements placed on us as coaches depending on what organizations we're working with. So, for example, as I said before, the Olympic Development Program with US Youth Soccer. So whereas we previously had not been asked to do a concussion awareness protocol, testing, evaluation, if you will, that has happened. So that is a reform. It's not a formally stated one that made the front page of Soccer America, but it's certainly something that's happened in the last couple of years. And then we probably all remember the introduction of headgear into the game, where athletes could wear headgear for protective reasons. And then there was a little bit of a controversy there because the referees looked upon it as extra equipment, so it became kind of a FIFA regulation. But I think we've got to a stage now where in most levels of competition in this country, be it because of an existing injury and the child has to wear protective headgear, or it can be allowed in certain competitions. So that's another thing that we see now that we never saw before.
And Ian, how do you address this with coaches in NSCAA courses?
Sure. Well, I knew the question was coming, so I did think about it a little bit. And we will probably have to get more robust in this issue because of what we're talking about today. In our in the courses which are designed for younger coaches, which Sam can embellish on extensively, we talk about developmentally appropriate. So we wouldn't be teaching heading in any significant way that anybody would really understand as formal heading at 6, 8, 10 anyway, because there's a lot of other things which are more developmentally appropriate, both technically and physically, for sure. Nowhere in the NSCAA programming do you actually do a course on heading where you spend an hour and a half practicing the technique of heading. But certainly heading as a technique, when we introduce it to players, 11, 12, 13 in the training environment, there's ways to train it, protocols to train it, which we will discuss. And but we will also discuss, in light of this most recent discussion, if we weren't already, that it's something you do for a very limited period of time, and then you get into areas of the game and the training which are much more relevant to the needs of the players, which would be controlling the ball with their feet, receiving, passing, dribbling, shooting, which are much more frequent occurrences at the youth ages of 11, 12, 13.
Perfect. Sam, any thoughts on the concussion reform for the sport in general, as well as what you're teaching in your courses to coaches?
Well, I think one of the things that we have as a prerequisite to the National Youth Coaching course, formerly the National Youth License, is that the coaches have to take that CDC course. So there's another piece where, in addition to the Olympic Development Program, we're trying to reach another segment of coaches to actually have to go through that course. And I think a number of state associations, leagues, and clubs have done similar things that they're now requiring that from their coaches. A lot of coaches that are involved in high school soccer probably have already done that course also through the National High School Federation. They have an online concussion course. So there's another piece where it's affected. In most of our courses that USU Soccer delivers, we actually don't go into a whole lot of detail on how to do any particular ball skill. We probably will in the near future develop a few technique courses that our state associations could deliver, and then certainly heading would be a part of it, and then a big part of that will be for kids now 11 and older. How do you begin to introduce it to them? How do you progressively teach that skill correctly? So that maybe we start off at even at 10 years old, okay, can you balance the ball on your forehead? Can you now begin juggling on your own to include your forehead as well as other parts of your body in juggling the ball? How to use lightweight balls, how to use Nerf balls, how to use volleyballs in training to learn those skills so that it's learned correctly. So I think there's a number of things that we, all of us in soccer, need to be thinking about in terms of what do we put out formally in coaching education to help train our coaches. I've always thought that the skill of heading is one that not that many youth soccer coaches know it well enough and teach it correctly. So there's an opportunity for us.
Sure. And we kind of already got into this already, but a part of the, you mentioned earlier, a part of the resolution includes limited heading for 10 and under, and then limited heading for 11 to 13. So several questions about that. How will this affect how coaches coach, and then how will this affect players both now and in the next few years? Sam, we'll start with you.
Well, I think what U.S. Soccer's put out for the 11 to 13 year age group is that it's limited training time on heading. They haven't put out any specifics on that yet. Is that X number of headers per training session? Is that X minutes per training session where you're actually working on the heading skill? So there's a few more details on that yet to come. But as how it affects coaches, it affects them with the 11 to 13s really only in thinking a little bit more intelligently about how do I put together a training session that's going to intentionally include teaching the skill of heading, and then observing my players on a regular basis whether I'm actually teaching them heading or not during training sessions and matches. When they do have the ball, are they doing it correctly? And part of that is also, quite frankly, reading how to not get yourself into situations where you're going to be colliding heads with another player. Mm-hmm. That's, the standalone head the ball, that's really no problem, assuming that the kid's been taught how to do it right. It's the challenge, it's the 50-50 challenge up in the air for a header. That's the hard part for coaches, to begin to teach players how to protect themselves, how to jump correctly, the timing of the jump, etc. So I think that's a lot of what we'll need to continue to do in our coaching education, all of the groups involved in this.
Ian, anything to add on how this will affect coaches, the way coaches coach, and then affecting players both now and coming years?
Sure. For the people that had a very immediate reaction to this article and the resolution from US Soccer, the articles by Mike Wojtarek, so on and so forth, if you weren't doing limited heading in training with 11s, 12s, and 13s already, then you probably don't have a lot of players, because they're probably not coming to training, because training heading for an extensive period of time is not the most fun training environment. So I don't know that for the majority of coaches, if not all the coaches in the country, the notion of limited heading repetitions in training for 11s, 12s, and 13s is anything radically new for them. But it does remind us, and it does put us on notice that it's something that we shouldn't be focusing on exclusively. There are many different ways that we might talk about heading. For people who have a similar haircut to myself, or hair that's similar color to Sam's, there was a video we used to watch from Pele, and Pele talked about heading the ball with your eyes open, your mouth shut, and on your forehead. I think that's still the case today as a basic protocol. if I'm working with 11s, 12s, 13s who aren't real confident with the skill, but we've decided we're going to try it, sometimes the service comes from a teammate. And one of the mantras that I like to use is 2 hands, underhand. So you're throwing the ball, serving the ball to your colleague, 2 hands underhand. It just changes the nature of the serve, so the receiver knows what's coming. It's not flung at them. There are protocols you can put in place that are really quite straightforward to not only introduce heading on a limited basis, but begin to teach the technique and get some good habits. As you introduce competition for the ball with 2 people going up and trying to head it, then you have some other really important physical technical timing issues you have to address. And I think 13, 14 is probably this time where that becomes a really significant issue to look at.
We're getting a few questions in about headgear, and it was kind of mentioned earlier a little bit. So I want both of your opinions on the use of headgear for players, either introducing it early, late, introducing it at all. How does that work? Ian, we'll go with you.
Okay. Well, for those people that follow professional soccer, and you see headgear worn by a guy called Peter Cech, who plays for Arsenal, plays, I believe, for the Czech Republic. He wears headgear because he has a pre-existing condition, and that is something that his doctors and his clubs have advised him to do. So that's why he wears it. I was recently working with Lehigh Valley United Soccer Club in Pennsylvania, and in the futsal, their goalkeepers wear some protective headgear because they're so close to the goal. The goals are very small, they're very solid, and they just feel that it's a good preventative in their futsal program. There is some research that suggests that if players wear headgear exclusively, it does actually empower them sometimes to take more risks. They become more reckless with the headgear. So for the people that manufacture headgear and obviously make a living out of manufacturing it, they'll have one argument. I recently watched a program, 60 Minutes, I believe, that said that a lot of the headgear doesn't actually do a lot to help you from neurological stress, but it has different psychological impacts to the positive and the negative. But one of them is occasionally it can empower athletes to put their heads in places they shouldn't be in the first place.
Sam, any thoughts on headgear?
I agree with Ian that for some players there's that false sense of security when they have on the headgear and perhaps get a little reckless in the way they head the ball or where they stick their head in. USU Soccer actually has had a statement on headgear that's been up on our website since the late 90s, 98, 99 I want to say, because the headgear piece has been around for quite a while. There's, as Ian alluded to, it can give a player that has already had a concussion some additional safety. But if you get hit hard enough, just from the ball, from another player, landing on the ground, whatever it might be, that the brain moves inside the skull, you're still going to get a concussion. You could be wearing a NASCAR helmet, and it's not going to stop your brain from moving inside the skull if you get hit with that much force. So it's more a matter of us coaches, teaching players a lot of the correct movements and skills in the game, reading the game in terms of where and how do I put myself into 50-50 situations, and then referees correctly calling the match. Perfect.
Okay, so we'll also go into a question that was was sent in by Dave H. So how will this safety protocol kind of affect how players moving up the competition ladder, and then how do we think this might change the way the game is played on the professional or even at international level? Sam?
I think it might be a little early for us to predict how it might affect the professional game, if at all. And from the professional game, then the international game, at least at the senior level, where the full national teams come in made up of pro players. I think at the youth national team level, it's probably not going to negatively affect us in the long run, because I think players of that caliber and that level of athleticism, if they start to learn the skill at 11 years of age, they're going to catch up pretty fast in terms of learning how to deal with the ball in the air. And I think it's actually a good age in general to teach the skill, because it's also an age where a player has begun to really develop their visual tracking acuity, and that is their abilities to track the ball in the air. And if I can't properly visually track the ball in the air, then getting myself in the right position to head the ball is almost impossible. So since that tracking ability is really beginning to become fully developed in those ages from 11 onward, 10 onward, then I think whether it's heading the ball, dealing with volleys, taking the ball out of the air, and receiving it, etc., a lot of that now becomes skills that we as coaches can begin to teach a whole lot more intentionally.
Ian, anything to add to that as players move up the competition ladder, and then as well as any changes to the pro or international level?
Sure. If I may just briefly come back to that after I've addressed the headgear issue again.
Okay.
People may be aware that Sam and I are coaches who are experienced and have a lot of exposure to the literature, but neither of us are pediatricians or neurosurgeons.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the headgear, when it comes to some of these issues, I would strongly encourage clubs and coaches to solicit feedback from pediatricians and neurologists, neurosurgeons, so on and so forth. Of course, they will get conflicting information because there's a lot of conflicting information out there, and then you have to sort through that information and determine what you trust the most. Because this is certainly an issue, because there are products like the protective headgear in the marketplace, and coaches may may think that's a good thing to go for their players, and they may ultimately come up with a different opinion, or right now they may be opposed to it and reverse the other way. So I do think it requires each person, in addition to guidelines and mandates and requirements, to inform themselves and make judgments, well-informed judgments. As far as whether the US will now become a soccer international backwater because of these concussion protocols, I think that's a little premature, to Sam's point. And I also think that if our players are exposed in a healthy, safe way at the ages of 11, 12, and 13, I don't see that being a major drawback. And I'm not convinced that the rest of the world, be it South America, Europe, wherever, is spending a tremendous amount of time, if any, on heading for 9s and 10-year-olds. And certainly, according to what we've seen from US soccer, we're not suggesting that heading doesn't take place at the 11, 12-year-old ages in the competition and in the training. It's just limited in the training.
One question that was tweeted into us from Alabama Soccer, and both of you are free to answer this. Do you see any changes to the development of goalkeepers due to this campaign, in particular dealing with crosses?
Well, that's a good question, and I think I know who wrote that question. But it would, if obviously as a coach I know that at 10 and younger we're not really doing headers, then it might affect a little bit how I have my kids taking a corner kick when we're the attacking team, and whether or not the goalkeeper's going to come out for a high ball if we're not really serving in high. Why would I be serving in a high ball if my kids aren't allowed to do headers? I would be driving low balls. I would be playing short corners, that sort of thing. Since from 11 onward, heading during the match is allowed, then I think there's no change for the goalkeepers in that corner kicks and crosses are still going to come in, and we're going to still have to train our goalkeepers how to deal with balls in the air, to come out to catch or box, because headers are occurring from 11 onward.
Ian?
Yeah, I think Sam's spot on. And I think one of the things as coaches we need to be mindful of, we can make this a coaching education session too, is that the environment very often dictates the skill set required. So I just spent a weekend in Pennsylvania working in futsal. So what the goalkeepers in terms of their technical requirement in the sport of futsal, is completely different than their technical requirement if they're in a full-sided game outdoors with an appropriately weighted soccer ball, and crosses are coming in and free kicks are coming in, and so on and so forth. So as we train our players and as we prepare them, this notion of developmentally appropriate again is something that, if it's a mantra, I apologize, but it's my mantra and Sam's mantra, and we're going to keep using it. Is it developmentally appropriate to be worrying about crossing with 10-year-old kids? Because does it occur in the game? No. When does crossing start to occur? Potentially. Although, I mean, obviously the ball can get in the air a little bit, but it's going to be very, very limited. So let's focus on handling, distribution, footwork, so on and so forth, and introduce, aerial challenges for the goalkeeper as they start to become a frequent reality of their competitive environment.
Cool. Another piece of what was released was in talking about substitution rules. Any thoughts on how substitution rules may change, if at all, Ian?
Well, coaches that wish to manipulate and take advantage of substitution rules exist all over the world in the English Premier League, certainly, and everywhere you see it. So I think whatever protocols we have in place, people will come up with ways to bend those rules, not with good intent, and then we'll have to find a new way around it. But it seems 100% appropriate to me that if there's a clear indication a player is struggling physically and may be able to come back to competition in that competition, but it's not clear, that when they're removed from the game, the team shouldn't have to play short in youth sports for sure. So the suggestions of the US soccer protocol that says you play even up numbers-wise while your player gets assessed under the terms of the concussion protocol, I think is 100% common sense. And if people weren't already doing that in the spirit of competition, then frankly, shame on them, because I think it's the right thing to do.
Sam?
Both the NSCAA and U.S. Soccer in their coaching education and via U.S. Soccer, U.S. Youth Soccer has supported this idea that err on the side of caution. We've always had that in the prevention and care of injuries discussion in a coaching course. Err on the side of caution. So I would hope that as U.S. Soccer develops what the substitution rules will be, and I think in their release it was more specifically to the situation of a concussion. Actually, we think that it's occurred. There's been, some kind of collision where we think a player might have been concussed. That it should be, we can take that player out. Then we will have to talk to the sports medicine people to find out how long does it take to do a proper sideline evaluation of that player. Do we give them 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever, and if that player's okay according to the sports medicine authority that's on hand to be able to go back in, okay, otherwise that player's out and we can substitute that player and it doesn't count against us in the total number of players that we're allowed to sub according to the rules that the competition's being played under. I hope that the suggestions go in that direction from U.S. Soccer, but we don't have anything definitive from them just yet.
Yeah. One question.
If I may, we know that, let's say the competition allows for 3 substitutions, that some genius somewhere, we can predict it now, will use this suggestion from US Soccer to get a 4th sub, because they'll now have players faking injury, and this is what will happen. I mean, as distasteful as it is to discuss, that is a reality. Someone somewhere will do it. But what we need to do occasionally is not create rules and knee-jerk to these bizarre situations that sometimes we as adults throw up, but take a slightly higher ground, if you will. So from my perspective, what US Soccer has suggested is wholly appropriate. It's in the best interest of the sport and in the best interest of kids, and it's in the best interest of 99.9% of us. But yes, we should all be aware that somebody will find a loophole to exploit. That's just the nature of competition.
Another question that was emailed in from Paul McNally. And he's just talking about how will this ruling affect high school coaches and the high school game, if at all.
I don't think it will, Monique. First of all, kids will be in club soccer allowed to begin to learn how to execute the skill of heading from age 11 onward. So by the time they get to be a high school freshman, sophomore, whenever they're eligible for the high school team, I think they will probably have had plenty of time, assuming that they are playing club soccer, to have learned that skill. Does it have any direct effect on high school soccer? No, not really, and only in that U.S. Soccer has no direct authority over high school soccer. That's all governed by the 50 high school athletic associations.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Ian?
Well, assuming that coaches do their job, as it were, and they do introduce heading at 11, 12, 13, it's in competition, it's in training. So when these young men and women, boys and girls, make high school at 14, 15, they should have some skill set. One of the challenges when I think about high school soccer is that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, if the high school game is played on the high school football field and the field is 120 by 60, the games get quite vertical, and there's a lot more probably instances for heading the ball in the game, very often off of goalkeeper punts and distributions. That's not a reflection of anything poor about high school soccer, other than sometimes the fields that the high school teams have to play on. So heading there's a pretty high incident of heading the soccer ball in a lot of high school soccer games, and the high school coaches have to hope that the youth coaches have done a decent job, and then the high school coaches can continue to work on that. But I don't think in of itself it's going to be a detriment to the high school game.
And then how do you recommend coaches approach these changes with their players, with parents, and then other club constituency groups? Ian?
Well, I think there's two extremes to that concern. One is parents, clubs, coaches who don't see it as much of an issue and are more concerned about getting the kid back to competition or back to training. So that you have that challenge. You also have a reasonable challenge that people now become quite scared about the concept of heading, and that there's an overreaction the other way. So what you would like is, hopefully this hangout helps people. Certainly the articles that Mike Voitaya's put out in Soccer America I think are quite helpful. I think if people actually read the FAQs from US Soccer, they're very, very helpful, because they're not alarmist in any way. They're just educational and they're common sense. So, again, we would hope, sometimes in vain, but we would hope that people use common sense, and that you have parents and coaches and clubs working together to not be alarmist, but also be mindful that these injuries are a little bit more common than we perhaps previously thought. I think that's one of the things that the education has alerted us to, is that we were perhaps all a little bit naive before about long-term concerns and looking for symptoms and then protocols. And so personally, I think this can only be good for the game, and certainly good for the health of the kids in the long term.
Sam, thoughts on how coaches can approach discussing these changes with players, parents, everyone else?
I think much of what Ian said is absolutely right on the money. The discussion with moms and dads needs to be, I hope, something that coaches are doing on a regular basis on a number of different topics about the development of their kids in soccer. But when it comes to this particular piece, it might affect some of the coaching and parent interaction with kids, maybe in the under 8, under 10 age group, where there might be some heading already going on the part of some of the kids. Most of that usually is voluntary on the part of the kids. They have perhaps have an older sibling, and they've seen their older brother or sister heading the ball, and so the younger kid is mimicking it. We're just going to have to train the kids that, okay, right now that's not allowed. You have to wait for a few years, and moms and dads, we're waiting for a few years, but it's all part of again, a good player development curriculum that hopefully every club has, and that it's a progressive one, and that we just wait on some ball skills until the kids get a little bit older for a number of athletic reasons, as well as complying with the laws of U.S. soccer.
Perfect. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this conversation up. Ian and Sam, thank you very much for your insight on this. And I do want to reiterate a point Ian made earlier, that do some research, do a lot of reading. There's a lot of information about this particular topic out there. So do your research, do what's best for your players. At the end of this hangout, there will be a recording, and they'll be available at nscaa.com or on the NSCAA's YouTube channel. We'll also tweet it out and put it on our Facebook page as well. We have 2 more hangouts coming up within the next week. One this coming Wednesday, November 18th, and one next Monday, the 23rd. So Wednesday's chat will feature 4 of our NSCAA Academy staff coaches that will be discussing the NSCAA residential course experience. We have 7 courses coming up in January, 2 different sites. One is in Sacramento, California. The other one's Sunrise, Florida. And these are great opportunities for coaches to fully immerse themselves in their coaching career and in their coaching education. You're surrounded by people who also love the sport and also learning more like you are. So again, that hangout is Wednesday, November 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And then we also have a hangout on Monday discussing implementing U.S. Soccer's small-sided games player development initiatives. And that will feature actually one of our panelists today, Ian. So Ian, can you give us a bit of a preview of that discussion?
Well, absolutely. So U.S. Soccer's player development initiatives, as they pertain to age groups and small-sided games, is relatively new and something that we're all learning about, understanding, certainly Sam and U.S. Youth Soccer and all the major youth organizations. And one of the things that we'd like to do in the realm of coaching education is try to help people interpret those initiatives and make sense of them. So I think sometimes as coaches we can feel a bit lonely that there's a rule change or something is given to us and then we're sort of left on our own to interpret it, come up with new ideas. So one of the ideas of our approach to this is to try to equip coaches with some tools to manage these new initiatives if they're not already employing 4 and 7 and 9s as it is.
Perfect. And that, again, is next Monday, the 23rd, and that, again, is at 1 p.m. Eastern, so be sure to join us. Again, Sam and Ian, thank you very much for today's discussion, and we'll see everyone later. Thanks.
Thanks, Monique. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.